Security officer forces black woman to open luggage. Freezes when diplomatic immunity card appears. The fluorescent lights of JFK International Airport's security checkpoint cast harsh shadows across the polished floor as Amara Okafor stood in line, her designer carry-on positioned neatly at her side. 20 hours of flight time from Addis Ababa had left dark circles beneath her eyes, but her posture remained impeccable, shoulders back, chin slightly raised, the way her father had taught her. Diplomats never slouched, even when exhausted, especially when exhausted. The line inched forward, travelers shuffling with the universal weariness of international flight. Amara checked her watch, a gift from the Nigerian ambassador after their successful trade negotiations last month. She had exactly 2 hours before her debriefing at the United Nations, barely enough time to make it through security and catch a taxi into Manhattan. She didn't notice Officer Richard Keller watching her from his position near the front of the queue. Didn't see how his eyes narrowed when they landed on her, or how he straightened his TSA uniform before sidling over to his supervisor with a whispered conversation. She was too busy reviewing mental notes for her presentation, fingers tapping against her passport, the diplomatic passport with its distinctive red cover that she'd placed atop her rolling luggage. When Amara reached the front of the line, the bored-looking officer barely glanced at her documentation before waving her through. She collected her passport and proceeded to the metal detectors, already removing her blazer and slipping off her shoes with the practiced efficiency of someone who spent half her life in transit. That's when Officer Keller stepped into her path. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step over here for additional screening," he said, gesturing toward a separate area where a female officer waited. His voice carried an edge that made several nearby travelers turn their heads. Amara paused, one shoe still in hand. "Is there a problem, officer?" "Random selection," Keller replied, though his eyes never met hers. "This way, please." Amara knew it wasn't random. In 15 years of diplomatic service, she'd been randomly selected more times than she could count. Today, however, she didn't have time for this routine indignity. The Secretary General himself was waiting for her report on the Ethiopian peace talks. "Officer, I have a time-sensitive meeting at the UN headquarters," she said, keeping her voice level as she reached for her diplomatic passport. "Perhaps if you check my—" "Everyone has somewhere to be, ma'am," Keller interrupted, his hand now firmly gripping the handle of her luggage. "Security protocols apply to all passengers." The female officer, whose name tag read Martinez, offered Amara an apologetic smile. "It won't take long, ma'am, just a quick bag check and pat down." Something in Officer Keller's stance told Amara this wouldn't be quick at all. She'd seen that look before, the slightly raised chin, the faint smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. For men like him, this was about power, about reminding people like her of their place. "Fine," Amara conceded, following them to the screening area. Around them, the airport continued its choreographed chaos, announcements blaring, reunions unfolding, goodbyes being whispered. No one paid attention to the well-dressed black woman being led away from the main security line. No one except Daniel Choi, Amara's colleague from the diplomatic mission, who had been waiting on the other side of security. His eyes met hers briefly before he pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. Officer Keller snapped on blue latex gloves with theatrical slowness. "Open the luggage, please." Amara unzipped her carry-on, revealing neatly folded clothes, toiletries in clear bags, and a stack of documents in a leather portfolio. Standard diplomat's luggage. "What's in the portfolio?" Keller demanded, pointing. "Confidential diplomatic documents," Amara replied. "Protected under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, which I'm sure you're familiar with." Keller's face hardened. "I need to see them." "I'm afraid that's not possible. Those documents are protected by diplomatic immunity. You're welcome to check everything else." "Ma'am, when you enter this country, you're subject to our security protocols," Keller said, his voice rising slightly. "No exceptions." By now, a small crowd had begun to gather, sensing the tension. Officer Martinez shifted uncomfortably beside Keller. "Rich, maybe we should call a supervisor," she suggested quietly. He ignored her. "If you have nothing to hide, you shouldn't have a problem showing me those documents." Amara felt her patience slipping. 15 years of diplomatic training had taught her to remain composed in the face of provocation, but fatigue and frustration were taking their toll. "Officer Keller," she said, noting how his eyes widened slightly when she used his name. "I understand you're doing your job, but I am a diplomatic envoy of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, and those documents contain sensitive information pertaining to ongoing peace negotiations. I cannot and will not show them to you or anyone else without proper authorization." Keller stepped closer, invading her personal space. "Listen, lady, I don't care what country you're from or what fancy title you have. In my checkpoint, you follow my orders." The word "my" hung in the air between them, a possessive claim to authority that sent a chill down Amara's spine. She'd encountered men like Keller throughout her career, men who viewed their small kingdoms of power as personal fiefdoms. Usually, she would navigate around them with practiced diplomacy. Today, she didn't have that luxury. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor," Amara stated firmly. "Immediately." "My supervisor will tell you the same thing," Keller replied, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "Security doesn't compromise for anyone." "Richard," Officer Martinez interjected more forcefully. "Protocol says we call a supervisor for diplomatic personnel." He shot her a glare that would have withered a lesser person, but Martinez held her ground. The crowd of onlookers had grown, some openly filming with their phones. In the distance, Amara spotted Daniel speaking urgently to someone in a higher-ranking TSA uniform. "Fine," Keller snapped. "But until Supervisor Chen gets here, your luggage stays sealed, and you stay right where you are." Amara nodded coolly, though inside she was calculating how this delay would impact her schedule. The Secretary General was not a man who tolerated tardiness, diplomatic incident or not. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they waited in tense silence. Keller maintained his aggressive posture, never stepping back, never relaxing his vigilance, as though Amara might suddenly make a break for it, diplomatic portfolio in hand. Finally, a woman in a senior TSA uniform approached, flanked by Daniel and another man Amara didn't recognize. "Officer Keller," the woman said sharply, "what's going on here?" "Random security check, Supervisor Chen," Keller replied, straightening. "This passenger is refusing to allow inspection of documents in her luggage." Supervisor Margaret Chen's expression remained neutral, but her eyes darted to Amara's red diplomatic passport, which was now visible on top of the partially opened luggage. "Ms. Okafor," Chen said, addressing Amara directly, "I apologize for any inconvenience. I understand you're with the Nigerian diplomatic mission." "That's correct," Amara confirmed. "I've just returned from peace talks in Ethiopia and have a debriefing at the UN headquarters in less than 2 hours. Chen nodded, then turned to Keller. "Officer, diplomatic personnel have specific protocols. You should have called me immediately." "With all due respect, ma'am," Keller began, "we've had intelligence about—" "That's enough, officer," Chen cut him off. "We'll discuss this later." She turned back to Amara. "Ms. Okafor, you're free to proceed. Agent Harris here will escort you through security." The man standing beside Daniel stepped forward, extending his hand. "James Harris, Diplomatic Security Service. We received a call from your colleague. I'll make sure you get through without further delay." Relief washed over Amara, though she kept her expression professional. "Thank you, Agent Harris." As she zipped up her luggage, Officer Keller leaned in, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Next time you might not have your friends to call, remember that." Before Amara could respond, Harris stepped between them. "Is there a problem, Officer Keller?" Keller backed away, hands raised in mock surrender. "No problem at all, just reminding our distinguished visitor about the importance of security." As Amara followed Harris toward the exit, she felt Keller's eyes boring into her back. The encounter left her shaken in a way she wouldn't readily admit. 15 years of diplomatic service had hardened her against such incidents, but this one had struck a nerve, perhaps because of the peace talks she'd just concluded, perhaps because of the rising tide of nationalism she'd observed in her travels, or perhaps simply because she was tired of fighting the same battles over and over again. Outside the security area, Daniel waited with a concerned expression. "Amara, are you okay? I saw what was happening and called DSS immediately." "I'm fine," she assured him, though the tension in her shoulders told a different story. "Nothing I haven't dealt with before." "That doesn't make it right," Daniel replied, taking her luggage. Ambassador Wells is already aware of the situation. She's furious. Amara sighed. Eleanor Wells, the U.S. ambassador working with their delegation, was a force of nature when angered. Tell her not to make a formal complaint. We have more important matters to focus on. Too late, Daniel said, showing her his phone screen where an email from Wells was already demanding a full investigation. You know how she is about these things. Agent Harris, who had been quietly listening, interjected. Ms. Acaffer, incidents like this need to be reported. Officer Keller clearly violated protocol regarding diplomatic personnel. And you think reporting him will change anything? Amara asked, fatigue evident in her voice. There will always be another Officer Keller. Maybe, Harris conceded, but if no one reports them, there will definitely be another one. As they walked toward the airport exit, Amara realized that the peaceful resolution she'd helped broker in Ethiopia suddenly seemed simpler than navigating the complexities of prejudice in her everyday life. She'd spent 3 weeks mediating between warring factions, finding common ground between people who had been killing each other for generations. Yet here, in one of the world's most cosmopolitan cities, she'd been reduced to her skin color in an instant. We've got a car waiting, Daniel informed her, checking his watch. If traffic cooperates, you'll still make your debriefing on time. Amara nodded gratefully, though her mind was already shifting to the presentation she would deliver to the Secretary General. The diplomatic portfolio in her luggage contained the framework for a peace agreement that could potentially end a conflict that had claimed thousands of lives. Against that backdrop, her encounter with Officer Keller seemed insignificant. But as their car navigated through the dense New York traffic, Amara couldn't shake the memory of Keller's final words to her. Next time you might not have your friends to call. It wasn't just a threat. It was a reminder of a reality she'd faced her entire life, from her childhood in Lagos to the hallowed halls of international diplomacy. She pulled out her phone and opened the email from Ambassador Wells. Perhaps it was time to stop letting such incidents slide. Perhaps it was time to use her position to address not just conflicts abroad, but the smaller, daily conflicts that eroded dignity and perpetuated division. With newfound resolve, Amara began typing her response. 3 days after the incident at JFK, Amara sat in Ambassador Wells' spacious office at the U.S. mission to the United Nations, watching as the older woman paced back and forth with barely contained fury. Absolutely unacceptable, Wells fumed, her typically immaculate silver bob swinging with each emphatic turn. The State Department has issued a formal apology, but that's not enough, not nearly enough. Amara maintained her composure, though she appreciated the ambassador's righteous anger on her behalf. The TSA has suspended Officer Keller pending investigation. That's more than usually happens in these cases. Wells stopped pacing and fixed Amara with a piercing look. Is that supposed to reassure me? That the bar is so low that a suspension is considered progress? She shook her head. This incident happened to a high-ranking diplomat with immunity. What about the thousands of travelers who don't have your credentials or connections? It was a question Amara had been asking herself since that day. Each time she'd mentally replayed the confrontation, she'd thought about how differently it might have ended if she hadn't been carrying a diplomatic passport, if Daniel hadn't been there to call for help, if she hadn't known exactly which international agreements protected her. The system is designed to protect itself, not to deliver justice, Amara observed quietly. Officer Keller is a symptom, not the disease. Wells sank into her leather chair with a sigh. I know, and that's what makes this so infuriating. She gestured toward the window where the Manhattan skyline stretched beneath a cloudless sky. Out there, the United States promotes itself as a beacon of equality and justice, yet within our own borders. Every country has its contradictions, Amara said diplomatically. Nigeria is no different. That doesn't excuse it, Wells replied sharply, especially not when it interferes with international relations. She tapped a folder on her desk. The Ethiopian peace agreement you helped negotiate, that's what matters, not some power-tripping security officer with a badge and a grudge. Amara nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced these issues were separate. The same structures of power that fueled conflict in Ethiopia, tribal divisions, resource competition, historical grievances, manifested differently but persistently in places like JFK Airport. "Ambassador," she began carefully, "I appreciate your support, but I'm concerned that focusing too much on this incident might distract from the peace agreement." Wells' expression softened slightly. "Amara, you've always been too pragmatic for your own good. This isn't just about one incident. It's about ensuring that diplomats like you can do your job without harassment." She leaned forward. "Besides, the agreement is proceeding beautifully, thanks largely to your work. The Secretary General specifically mentioned your mediation skills in this morning's briefing." Pride briefly overcame Amara's fatigue. 3 weeks of intense negotiations, sleeping in makeshift quarters, and navigating centuries-old hostilities had tested her diplomatic skills to their limits. The framework agreement, now advancing through the UN channels, represented the best hope for lasting peace in the region. "There's more," Wells continued, sliding a document across the desk. "The Secretary General is establishing a new crisis response team for emerging conflicts. He wants you to lead it." Amara stared at the document, momentarily speechless. Leading the crisis response team would be a significant promotion, a recognition of her skills that diplomats waited decades to receive. "This is unexpected," she managed. Wells smiled for the first time since Amara had entered her office. "Is it? You've proven yourself in some of the most challenging diplomatic environments imaginable. The Secretary General needs someone who can navigate complex situations with grace and determination." Her smile turned wry. "Someone who can face down aggressive security officers without losing her composure might be just right for handling warlords and dictators." Amara allowed herself a small laugh. "When you put it that way." "There's one condition," Wells added, her expression growing serious again. "The Secretary General wants you to work with our diplomatic security team to review and improve protocols for diplomatic personnel at U.S. ports of entry, in light of your recent experience." And there it was, the incident with Officer Keller, which Amara had hoped to put behind her, now directly linked to her professional advancement. Part of her wanted to refuse, to keep her focus solely on international peacekeeping rather than domestic policy reforms. But another part, the part that remembered every random security check, every suspicious glance, every moment of having to prove she belonged in spaces where others moved freely. That part knew this was an opportunity that shouldn't be squandered. "I'll do it," she said finally, "on one condition of my own." Wells raised an eyebrow, "Which is?" "I want Officer Keller involved in the process." Seeing Wells' surprise, Amara continued. "Not as a punitive measure, but because meaningful change requires understanding all perspectives, including his." For a moment, Wells looked as though she might object, but then understanding dawned in her eyes. "You want to transform your antagonist into an ally." "I want to address the root causes, not just the symptoms," Amara corrected. "Officer Keller acted the way he did for reasons that extend beyond one encounter with one diplomat. If we're going to improve the system, we need to understand those reasons." Wells leaned back, regarding Amara with newfound respect. "This is why you succeed where others fail. You see opportunities for reconciliation where most people only see conflict." She tapped the document on her desk. "I'll speak to diplomatic security about your condition. No guarantees, but I'll try." "That's all I ask," Amara replied, rising from her seat. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to prepare for tomorrow's follow-up session on the Ethiopian agreement." As she left the ambassador's office, Amara's phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from TSA Supervisor Margaret Chen, requesting a meeting to discuss the JFK incident. Attached was a formal letter of apology from the agency's director, along with assurances that appropriate actions were being taken. Amara typed a brief response accepting the meeting invitation, then slipped her phone back into her pocket. The wheels of bureaucracy were turning, slowly as always, but turning nonetheless. Whether they would produce meaningful change remained to be seen. Outside the U.S. Mission building, the New York spring had brought cherry blossoms to the nearby park. Amara paused for a moment, watching as pink petals drifted onto the sidewalk. She thought about Officer Keller, about the peace agreement in Ethiopia, about the new position the Secretary General had offered her. Different challenges, different scales, but all connected by the same fundamental questions of power, justice, and human dignity. With renewed determination, she hailed a taxi and headed toward the Nigerian consulate, where Daniel would be waiting with updates on the Ethiopian delegation's arrival. There was still much work to be done, both abroad and at home. The conference room at the Department of Homeland Security headquarters buzzed with tense energy as various officials gathered around the long table. Amara sat beside Agent Harris, reviewing her notes while stealing occasional glances at the door. Officer Richard Keller was scheduled to attend this meeting, his first since being suspended, and his absence was becoming conspicuous. "He'll be here," Harris assured her quietly, "though I'm still not convinced this is a good idea." Amara offered a measured smile. Most good ideas don't seem like good ideas until they work. Harris chuckled. "Is that a Nigerian proverb?" "No, that's just diplomatic experience talking." The door swung open, and Officer Keller entered alongside Supervisor Chen. His usual confidence had diminished, replaced by a wary stiffness as he surveyed the room. When his eyes landed on Amara, surprise briefly flickered across his face before he quickly masked it with a neutral expression. "Thank you for joining us, Officer Keller," said Director Phillips, the stern-faced head of TSA operations. "Please take a seat." Keller nodded tersely and sat at the far end of the table, as distant from Amara as the seating arrangement allowed. Supervisor Chen took the chair beside him, her posture suggesting she was ready to intervene if necessary. "Those who haven't been briefed," Phillips continued, "this meeting is to address the procedural failures that occurred during an incident involving Ms. Amara Okafor, Deputy Chief of Mission at the Nigerian Embassy and Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General." He nodded respectfully toward Amara. "Ms. Okafor has graciously agreed to assist us in reviewing and improving our protocols for diplomatic personnel, despite the unfortunate circumstances that brought this issue to our attention." All eyes turned briefly to Keller, who stared resolutely at the table before him. "Before we begin," Amara said, her voice calm but commanding, "I want to clarify something. I'm not here to assign blame or seek punishment. I'm here because what happened at JFK reflects systemic issues that affect diplomatic relations and, more broadly, how we treat each other across differences of nationality, race, and status." She paused, allowing her words to settle. "My goal is improvement, not retribution." A subtle shift occurred in the room, shoulders relaxed slightly, expressions softened. Even Keller glanced up, momentarily meeting her gaze before looking away. "Well said, Ms. Okafor," Director Phillips acknowledged. "Now, let's review the incident chronologically, identifying where protocols were breached and how they might be strengthened." For the next hour, the group methodically dissected the encounter at JFK. Security footage was displayed, showing the interaction from multiple angles. Amara watched, somewhat detached, as her digital self was confronted by Keller. Seeing it objectively was different from having lived it, the power dynamics even more apparent from this perspective. When the footage ended, Director Phillips turned to Keller. "Officer, would you care to explain your actions?" Keller cleared his throat. "I was following protocol for suspicious behavior," he stated, though his voice lacked conviction. "The passenger, Ms. Okafor, was carrying what appeared to be sensitive documents and seemed nervous." "Seemed nervous," Supervisor Chen interjected. "Based on what indicators?" She was checking her watch repeatedly, tapping her fingers, looking around. "I had just completed a 20-hour flight and was facing a tight deadline for a UN security briefing," Amara explained evenly. "Yes, I was checking the time. I believe most travelers do so when they have connecting appointments." Keller shifted uncomfortably. "We'd received intelligence about potential security concerns from flights originating in Africa." The room fell silent. Amara felt rather than saw the discomfort of the other officials. The vague reference to intelligence without specifics, the broad generalization about an entire continent, it was textbook profiling, thinly disguised as security procedure. "Officer Keller," Director Phillips said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "are you suggesting that all passengers from African countries warrant additional scrutiny?" "No, sir," Keller replied quickly. "Just that we were instructed to be extra vigilant with certain flight patterns." "And yet," Amara observed, "I noted at least 7 other passengers from my flight who proceeded through security without additional screening. None of them were black." Keller's face flushed. I didn't. Let me be clear, she continued, not unkindly. I'm not accusing you of conscious racism, Officer Keller. I'm pointing out patterns that might not be visible to you but are glaringly obvious to those on the receiving end. Agent Harris intervened. Setting aside motivations for the moment, protocol clearly states that diplomatic passport holders are to be referred to supervisors immediately. That didn't happen here. No, it didn't, Supervisor Chen confirmed. And that's a straightforward procedural failure we can address with additional training. Amara leaned forward. But that addresses only the surface issue. If Officer Keller had recognized my diplomatic status immediately, this particular incident wouldn't have escalated. But the underlying problem, the profiling that led to my selection in the first place, would remain unaddressed. Director Phillips nodded thoughtfully. You're suggesting we need to look beyond this specific incident to the broader patterns of screening decisions. Exactly, Amara confirmed. And to do that effectively, we need honest input from officers on the front lines. She turned to Keller directly, including Officer Keller. Keller looked up, clearly surprised to be addressed. Me. Yes, Amara said simply. You're in a unique position to provide insight. Your actions that day weren't created in a vacuum. They were shaped by training, by institutional culture, by the subtle and not-so-subtle messages about who represents a threat. The room had grown very still, all eyes moving between Amara and Keller. What do you want from me? Keller asked, a defensive edge still present in his voice but tempered now with uncertainty. Your perspective, Amara replied. Your honest assessment of the factors that influence screening decisions, not as a scapegoat but as someone with valuable frontline experience. For a long moment, Keller said nothing, visibly processing her words. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its earlier bravado. Most of us are just trying to do our jobs, to keep people safe. The protocols and training tell us what to look for, but in the moment we have to make split-second decisions based on instinct, I guess. And what shapes that instinct? Amara prompted gently. Keller hesitated, then admitted, experience, media, training scenarios, the patterns we're told to watch for. He paused, then added reluctantly, and yes, probably some biases we're not always aware of. It was a small concession, but Amara recognized it as progress. That's exactly the kind of insight we need if we're going to improve the system. Director Phillips cleared his throat. Ms. Ackhaffer, are you suggesting that Officer Keller should be part of the protocol review team, despite his involvement in the incident that prompted it? I am, Amara confirmed. Sometimes the most valuable perspectives come from those who have made mistakes and are willing to learn from them. She looked directly at Keller, assuming Officer Keller is willing. All eyes turned to Keller, who appeared genuinely conflicted. His career had been jeopardized by this incident, yet here was the very person he had wronged, advocating for his involvement rather than his punishment. Why, he asked Amara, genuine confusion in his voice. Why would you want me involved after what happened? Amara considered her response carefully. Because meaningful change doesn't come from excluding those we disagree with. It comes from difficult conversations and uncomfortable truths. She paused. In my work mediating conflicts, I've learned that the path to resolution begins with understanding all perspectives, especially those that challenge our own. Something shifted in Keller's expression, a subtle softening, a crack in the defensive armor. If you think I can help, he said finally, then yes, I'm willing. Director Phillips looked impressed despite himself. Then it's settled. Officer Keller will join the protocol review team, working directly with Ms. Ackhaffer and Agent Harris. He checked his watch. We'll reconvene tomorrow to establish the team's parameters and timeline. For now, thank you all for your participation. As the meeting dispersed, Amara gathered her notes, aware that Keller was lingering nearby, clearly wanting to speak with her but unsure how to approach. She decided to make it easier for him. Officer Keller, she said, looking up, would you have time for coffee before tomorrow's meeting? I think it might be helpful for us to speak one-on-one. Surprise registered on his face, followed by wary acceptance. Sure, there's a cafe in the lobby. Perfect, Amara replied with a professional smile. Shall we say 4 o'clock? Keller nodded, still looking somewhat bewildered by this turn of events. As he left with Supervisor Chen, Agent Harris approached Amara with an impressed expression. "That was masterfully handled," he said quietly, "though I still have my doubts about involving Keller." Amara gathered her belongings. Transformation rarely happens from the outside. If we want real change, we need to engage with those who resist it most strongly. "Is that what you did in Ethiopia? Engage with the most resistant parties?" "Precisely," Amara confirmed. "The faction leaders who seemed most implacable often became the strongest advocates for peace once they felt their concerns were truly heard." She smiled slightly. "Officer Keller is hardly a warlord, but the principle remains the same." Harris shook his head, impressed. "The Secretary General chose well when he appointed you to lead the crisis response team." As they walked toward the exit, Amara's phone chimed with a notification. It was a message from Daniel. "News about Ethiopia just broke. Check your email." With a sense of foreboding, Amara quickly opened her email to find an urgent message from the UN mission in Addis Ababa. The peace agreement she had worked so tirelessly to secure was in jeopardy. One of the faction leaders had been assassinated, and his successor was threatening to withdraw from the accord. "Bad news?" Harris asked, noting her expression. "The worst kind," Amara replied, already mentally calculating flight times to Ethiopia. "Peace is always more fragile than conflict." She looked up, determination replacing dismay. "I need to get back to New York immediately. The Secretary General will want an emergency session." As they hurried toward the exit, Amara realized that her meeting with Keller would have to be postponed. The work of diplomacy never paused, not for personal vindication, not for systemic reform, not even for the necessary process of healing and reconciliation. But as she slid into the waiting car, Amara made a mental note to reschedule with Keller before her likely departure for Ethiopia. Some conversations were too important to abandon, even when the world's attention demanded to be elsewhere. The Ethiopian crisis would consume her attention in the days ahead, but the smaller, more personal crisis of understanding between herself and Officer Keller, that, too, deserved resolution. In her experience, peace began with individual conversations, with small bridges built across chasms of misunderstanding. From such modest foundations, greater structures of justice and equality might eventually rise. 2 weeks later, Amara found herself in the unlikely position of sharing a meal with Officer Richard Keller in a small Ethiopian restaurant in Washington, D.C. The Protocol Review Committee had been meeting intensively, and after a particularly productive session, Amara had suggested they continue their discussion over dinner. "I've never had Ethiopian food before," Keller admitted, eyeing the large injera bread topped with various stews and vegetables that occupied the center of their table. "Then you're in for a treat," Amara replied, demonstrating how to tear off a piece of the spongy bread and use it to scoop up some of the spiced lentils. "In Ethiopia, sharing food from a common plate symbolizes community and trust. Even bitter enemies will break bread together during peace negotiations." Keller attempted to mimic her technique, somewhat clumsily, but smiled with surprise after his first bite. "That's really good, spicy but good." "The best conversations happen over good food," Amara observed, watching as Keller became more comfortable with the unfamiliar dining style. "It's hard to maintain hostility when you're sharing a meal." Keller's expression turned thoughtful. "Is that how you got those warring factions to talk to each other, fed them dinner?" Amara laughed lightly. "It wasn't quite that simple, but yes, communal meals were part of the process. Breaking bread together reminds us of our shared humanity." For a moment they ate in companionable silence, a marked contrast to their first encounter at JFK. Over the past 2 weeks, their professional relationship had evolved from wary antagonism to cautious respect. Keller had proven surprisingly insightful during the protocol review sessions, often identifying procedural gaps that others overlooked. "I owe you an apology," Keller said suddenly, setting down his fork. "Not just the official one I was ordered to give, but a real one. What happened at the airport?" He shook his head. "I was out of line." Amara regarded him thoughtfully. "May I ask you something, Officer Keller?" "Richard," he corrected, "and yes." "Richard," she acknowledged with a nod. "What was going through your mind that day, when you first decided to pull me aside for additional screening?" He considered the question seriously, avoiding the easy deflection of procedure or protocol. Honestly, I saw someone who looked out of place. Expensive clothes, designer luggage, checking her watch like she had somewhere important to be. He hesitated. And yes, I saw a black woman who didn't fit my mental image of who would be carrying diplomatic documents. The admission hung between them, honest, uncomfortable, but necessary. "Thank you for your candor," Amara said quietly. "It's rare for people to acknowledge such thoughts." "Working with you these past weeks has been educational," Richard admitted. "Watching how you handle yourself in those meetings, how you navigate between all these agencies and personalities, it's made me rethink some assumptions." "That's how change begins," Amara observed. "Not with grand pronouncements or policy overhauls, but with individual reckonings." Richard nodded, then hesitated before asking, "Can I ask you something now?" "Of course." "Why did you fight to keep me on the committee? You could have had me fired, most people would have." Amara considered her response carefully. "Firing you would have satisfied a desire for retribution, but it wouldn't have addressed the underlying issues, and it would have reinforced the narrative that these problems are about individual bad apples rather than systemic patterns." Richard processed this, "So I'm not just a bad apple. You're a person operating within a system that shapes your perceptions and rewards certain behaviors," Amara replied diplomatically. "Changing the system requires understanding how it influences those within it." "That's very generous," Richard said, clearly struggling to find the right word. "It's not generosity," Amara corrected gently. "It's pragmatism. In my work, I've learned that lasting change rarely comes from punishment alone. It comes from creating pathways for people to grow beyond their mistakes." Richard fell silent, absorbing her words. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new note of sincerity. "The protocols we've been revising, they'll make a difference, but they won't fix everything, will they?" "No," Amara admitted. "Procedures and training are important, but they can't eliminate the unconscious biases we all carry. That requires deeper, more personal work." She paused. "But acknowledging those biases, as you've just done, that's a significant step." Their conversation was interrupted by Amara's phone vibrating insistently. She glanced at the screen to see multiple messages from Daniel. "Turn on the news. Your airport incident has gone viral." With a sense of foreboding, Amara excused herself and stepped outside to call Daniel. "What's happening?" she asked as soon as he answered. "Someone posted security footage of your confrontation with Officer Keller," Daniel explained rapidly. "It's everywhere. Twitter, CNN, all the major networks. The hashtag #diplomatic immunity is trending worldwide." Amara closed her eyes briefly, processing this unwelcome development. "How bad is it?" "The footage is edited to show the most confrontational moments," Daniel replied. "It makes Keller look terrible and you look dignified. The public reaction is overwhelmingly in your favor. The State Department is being flooded with calls for comment." "And the Ethiopian peace process? Is this affecting those negotiations?" "Not directly, but there's speculation about whether this will impact your role. The new faction leader is apparently asking if you'll still be involved given the American controversy." Amara sighed deeply. What had been a private incident, gradually being resolved through careful diplomacy, had now been thrust into the public spotlight, transformed into yet another front in the ongoing culture wars. "I need to get back to New York," she told Daniel. "Set up a meeting with Ambassador Wells and the Secretary General's office. We need to get ahead of this." "Already done," Daniel assured her. "There's a car waiting at your hotel." Amara ended the call and returned to the restaurant, where Richard was looking at his own phone with growing alarm. "You've seen it?" she asked, noting his expression. He nodded grimly. "My phone's been blowing up with messages from colleagues. Apparently, I'm the new poster boy for racist security practices." Despite the seriousness of the situation, Amara couldn't help feeling a twinge of sympathy for Richard. The man sitting across from her, who had shown genuine growth over the past weeks, was now being reduced to a two-dimensional villain in the court of public opinion. "I need to return to New York immediately," she told him. "This situation requires careful management." Richard nodded, resignation evident in his posture. I understand. For what it's worth, I'm sorry this has become a public spectacle. That wasn't what either of us wanted. No, Amara agreed, but we'll have to work with the reality we have, not the one we would prefer. She gathered her belongings. The committee meeting tomorrow should probably proceed without me, Richard interrupted. Under the circumstances, my presence might be counterproductive. Amara considered this, then shook her head. No, that would only reinforce the simplified narrative that's emerging. We need to demonstrate that complex issues require nuanced responses, not public shaming. Richard looked surprised. You still want me there, even with this media firestorm? Especially with this media firestorm, Amara replied firmly. Running from controversy solves nothing. Trust me, I've mediated enough conflicts to know that hiding only prolongs the inevitable reckoning. For the first time since they'd met, Richard looked at her with something approaching admiration. You really do practice what you preach, don't you? I try, Amara said simply. Now I really must go. I'll see you at tomorrow's meeting. As she left the restaurant, Amara steeled herself for the challenges ahead. The leaked footage had added a new dimension to an already complex situation, transforming a personal encounter into a public symbol of larger societal tensions. Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying this story so far. If you're finding value in this content, please consider hitting that subscribe button and dropping a comment to let me know where you're watching from. Your support means everything and helps me create more content like this. Now, let's get back to Amara's story. She'd spent her career navigating between public narratives and private realities, between symbolic gestures and substantive changes. This situation would require all of her diplomatic skills, not just to manage the public relations aspect, but to ensure that the real work of reform continued despite the sensationalized coverage. In the car heading toward her hotel, Amara watched as clips from the airport confrontation played on the vehicle's built-in screens. The footage showed only fragments of the encounter, Richard's most aggressive moments, her most composed responses. Missing was the context, the complexity, the human dimensions of their interaction. Amara switched off the screen. The simplified narrative unfolding in the media threatened to undermine the more nuanced understanding she and Richard had been developing. It was a stark reminder that peace-building, whether between nations or individuals, required space for complexity that public discourse rarely allowed. As the car navigated through Washington's evening traffic, Amara began composing a statement in her mind. She would need to acknowledge the public's concerns without feeding the outrage machine, to defend the importance of procedural reforms without personalizing the issue around Richard Keller. Most importantly, she would need to redirect attention to the principles at stake rather than the personalities involved. It would be a delicate balance, one that would test her diplomatic skills in ways that international negotiations rarely did. But as challenging as the situation had become, Amara remained committed to the pathway she had chosen. Not retribution, not division, but the harder, slower road toward genuine understanding and lasting change. The next morning, Amara stood before a forest of microphones in the UN headquarters press room, cameras flashing as journalists shouted questions from every direction. Ambassador Wells stood supportively at her side, along with a stern-faced representative from the State Department. I'll make a brief statement and then take a few questions, Amara announced, her voice steady despite the chaos. The room gradually quieted. As many of you are aware, footage has emerged of an incident involving myself and a TSA officer at JFK Airport 2 weeks ago. While I regret that this private matter has become a public spectacle, I believe it presents an opportunity for constructive dialogue about diplomatic protocols and the broader issues of bias in security procedures. She paused, allowing her words to register before continuing. Following this incident, I've been working closely with the Department of Homeland Security, the State Department, and TSA officials to review and strengthen protocols regarding diplomatic personnel. This collaborative effort has been productive and forward-looking, focused on improvements rather than recriminations. A reporter from the Washington Post raised his hand. Ms. Akaffer, do you believe the officer's actions were racially motivated? Amara had anticipated this question. I believe that unconscious bias affects many of our institutions and interactions. However, Reducing complex systemic issues to individual motivations rarely leads to meaningful solutions. Our focus has been on addressing the procedural gaps that allowed this situation to escalate. But the footage clearly shows discriminatory treatment, the reporter pressed. Aren't you downplaying racism to protect the officer involved? I'm prioritizing structural reform over personal vindication, Amara replied firmly. The officer in question has been actively participating in our protocol review committee, offering valuable insights from his frontline experience. His willingness to engage constructively demonstrates the kind of growth that punitive measures rarely achieve. Murmurs rippled through the press corps. This was not the narrative of righteous anger they had expected from a diplomat subjected to public humiliation. A reporter from CNN stood. Ms. Acaffer, there are calls for the officer's termination. Do you support those demands? No, I do not, Amara stated unequivocally. Firing one officer might satisfy a desire for punishment, but it wouldn't address the underlying issues. I've seen firsthand how complex conflicts require comprehensive solutions, not symbolic sacrifices. Ambassador Wells leaned toward the microphone. If I may add, Ms. Acaffer's approach reflects the highest traditions of diplomacy. She has turned an unfortunate incident into an opportunity for institutional improvement. The State Department fully supports her handling of this situation. Another reporter raised her hand. Ms. Acaffer, how will this incident affect your work on the Ethiopian peace process? There are reports that some faction leaders are questioning your continued involvement. Here was the question Amara had been dreading, the one that touched on her primary concern. The Ethiopian peace agreement remained precarious, and any distraction threatened its fragile progress. My commitment to the Ethiopian peace process remains unwavering, she responded. I've been in constant communication with all parties involved, and we are proceeding as planned with the next round of negotiations. The faction leaders understand that this incident is separate from our work together. But isn't there a connection? The reporter persisted. Both situations involve issues of power, prejudice, and justice. Amara considered this thoughtfully. Yes, there are parallels. In both contexts, progress requires moving beyond simplistic narratives of villains and victims. It requires creating space for transformation, whether of individuals or nations. She paused. The same principles that guide my approach to international conflict resolution have informed my response to this incident. A respectful silence fell over the room as journalists absorbed her words. Even in this contentious setting, Amara's diplomatic skill was evident. Her ability to reframe the conversation, to find common ground amid division. One final question, she announced, gesturing to a young reporter near the back. Ms. Acaffer, what message would you like the public to take from this incident? It was the perfect opening for her concluding remarks. I would ask people to remember that lasting change requires more than outrage. It requires the patience to engage with complexity, the courage to resist simplistic narratives, and the wisdom to recognize humanity even in those with whom we disagree. She smiled slightly. In my work, I've learned that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to navigate it with dignity and purpose. That applies as much to airport security checkpoints as it does to war zones. With that, she stepped away from the microphones, ignoring the barrage of follow-up questions as she and Ambassador Wells exited through a side door. In the quiet of the hallway, Wells gave her an approving nod. Masterfully handled, the ambassador said. You've managed to redirect the conversation without minimizing the issue. Let's hope it's enough, Amara replied, checking her phone to find several missed calls from Daniel. The Ethiopian delegation arrives tomorrow, and I need this media circus contained before then. The Secretary General has issued a statement of support, Wells informed her. And the TSA director is holding his own press conference this afternoon to outline the reforms your committee has recommended. Amara nodded gratefully. And Officer Keller, how is he handling the publicity? He's been placed on administrative leave for his own protection, Wells said with a grimace. Apparently, he's received threats. Amara sighed heavily. This is exactly what I hope to avoid. Public shaming rarely leads to genuine change. It just drives resentment underground. You can't control how others respond, Wells reminded her gently. You can only control your own actions. I know, Amara acknowledged, but it's frustrating to see a teachable moment transformed into a witch hunt. They reached the elevator that would take them to the secure conference rooms where the Ethiopian delegation would be meeting. Before pressing the button, Wells turned to Amara with an evaluative look. You know, when the Secretary General first suggested you for the crisis response team, there were concerns that you might be too idealistic, too committed to reconciliation at the expense of accountability. She smiled wryly. I think you've proved them wrong. Your approach combines principle with pragmatism in a way that's all too rare. Amara accepted the compliment with a modest nod. I learned long ago that righteous anger, however justified, rarely builds lasting peace. Sometimes the most radical act is to choose understanding over vengeance. As the elevator doors opened, Amara's phone buzzed with a text message from an unexpected source. Richard Keller. Saw your press conference, he'd written. Thank you for your integrity. Whatever happens with my job, you've taught me something important about dignity and forgiveness. Despite the challenges still ahead, the fragile Ethiopian peace process, the ongoing protocol reforms, the media scrutiny that showed no signs of abating, Amara felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. In the midst of conflict, a small bridge of understanding had been built. It was a beginning, not an end. But beginnings were where all lasting change took root. 6 months later, Amara stood at the window of her temporary office in Addis Ababa, watching as the Ethiopian sunrise painted the mountains with golden light. Behind her, the walls were covered with maps and diplomatic cables, the physical manifestation of months of intensive negotiations that had, against considerable odds, held the peace agreement together. A knock at the door interrupted her reflection. Daniel entered, carrying a tablet and wearing the weary expression of someone who had been working through the night. The final signatures are confirmed, he announced, his fatigue giving way to quiet satisfaction. All faction leaders have ratified the power-sharing arrangement. The UN Oversight Committee has been approved unanimously. Amara allowed herself a rare moment of visible relief. So it's official, the ceasefire holds. More than holds, Daniel corrected, handing her the tablet. Look at the statement from Commander Bikel. He's publicly commended your mediation and called for national reconciliation. Amara scanned the document with growing amazement. Bikel had been the most recalcitrant of the faction leaders, initially refusing even to sit at the same table as his opponents. His endorsement of the peace process represented a transformation few had thought possible. This is remarkable, she acknowledged, returning the tablet to Daniel, especially given his resistance during the early negotiations. Your approach worked, Daniel said simply, the same way it worked with those TSA protocols back in the States. The mention of the TSA brought to mind the changes that had unfolded in parallel with the Ethiopian peace process. The protocol committee had completed its work, implementing new training procedures and accountability measures for diplomatic encounters. Richard Keller, after a brief suspension, had been reinstated and now served as a training officer, sharing his experience as a cautionary tale for new recruits. The media frenzy had eventually subsided, though the incident had entered the broader conversation about bias in law enforcement, one more data point in an ongoing national reckoning. What had mattered most to Amara, however, was not the public narrative, but the private growth she had witnessed in Richard and others involved in the reform process. Different scales, same principles, Amara replied to Daniel. Create space for dignity, acknowledge harm without defining people by their worst moments, focus on structural changes rather than individual blame. And it works, Daniel observed, gesturing toward the maps where ceasefire zones had been carefully delineated. Though I doubt many people see the connection between airport security reforms and preventing civil war. Amara smiled slightly. Peace-building is peace-building, whether between nations or individuals. The scale changes, but the fundamentals remain the same. Her phone chimed with an incoming email, a message from Ambassador Wells with the subject line, Urgent, Secretary General request. Amara opened it to find that the Secretary General was requesting her immediate return to New York for a new assignment. mediating tensions between two nuclear powers whose decades-long border dispute had recently escalated toward military confrontation. "Another crisis?" Daniel asked, noting her expression. "Isn't there always?" Amara replied, already mentally calculating travel arrangements and briefing materials. As she packed her documents and prepared to leave the office that had been her home for the past 6 months, Amara reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From a tense confrontation at JFK Airport to peace negotiations in Ethiopia to an impending mission between nuclear powers, a trajectory that might seem disconnected to outside observers but made perfect sense to her. Each situation, regardless of scale or context, called upon the same fundamental skills: the ability to see beyond immediate conflicts to underlying interests, the patience to build trust across deep divides, the courage to pursue reconciliation when retribution seemed more satisfying. Her encounter with Officer Richard Keller could have been merely an unpleasant memory, a personal indignity to be filed away with other such experiences. Instead, it had become a reminder of possibilities, of how tension could be transformed into understanding, how confrontation could lead to collaboration, how bridges could be built in the most unlikely places. As Amara prepared to face her next diplomatic challenge, she carried that reminder with her, a small but significant testament to her belief that peace, in all its forms, began with the recognition of common humanity across the lines that divided us. The diplomatic immunity card that had frozen Officer Keller in his tracks that day at JFK had been more than a symbol of her official status. It had been the beginning of a journey toward mutual recognition, a journey that continued with each new conflict she was called upon to resolve, each new divide she was asked to bridge. In a world where division seemed ever deeper and reconciliation ever more elusive, Amara's work offered a quiet counter-narrative, a persistent belief that understanding remained possible, even in the most fractured relationships. It was this belief that had sustained her through the Ethiopian negotiations, that would guide her in the nuclear standoff to come, and that had transformed an airport confrontation into an opportunity for genuine change. As she shouldered her bag and headed for the door, Amara paused for one last look at the maps on her wall, the visual record of a peace painstakingly constructed from the ashes of conflict. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tensions, new opportunities for both breakdown and breakthrough. But today, at least, peace held, both in Ethiopia and in the small, personal territory between herself and Officer Richard Keller. For a diplomat who had dedicated her life to building bridges across chasms of difference, that was no small victory. With renewed determination, Amara stepped into the hallway where Daniel waited to escort her to the airport. The work of diplomacy, like the work of human understanding, was never truly finished. There would always be another crisis, another conflict, another moment where dignity and justice hung in the balance. But with each such moment came the possibility of transformation. In that possibility, Amara had found her calling, and her hope for a world where diplomatic immunity cards might someday become relics of a divided past, rather than necessary protections in a divided present. As she left the building where peace had been so carefully negotiated, Amara carried that hope with her, not as a naive optimism, but as a hard-won conviction that even the deepest divisions could be bridged by those with the courage to see humanity on both sides. It was this conviction that had turned a security checkpoint confrontation into an opportunity for growth, that had transformed warring factions into cautious partners for peace, and that would guide her in the challenging negotiations that lay ahead. In a world often defined by its conflicts, Amara Akaffer remained dedicated to a simple but revolutionary principle. That understanding could triumph over division, that reconciliation could prevail over retribution, and that peace, however fragile, however hard-won, was always worth pursuing.